But I really wanted to dive into the information and have more of a conversation because this is most certainly an area that we've been thinking about for quite some time, but we also recognize that it's being talked about all over the country in different capacities. And so I thought, even though Shay gave me a very broad scope here to talk about, I thought it was important to level set, talk about some of the things that we've worked on around SOGI data with FPF, and also kind of some of the things that we're looking at and why we're looking at those. So first and foremost, I wanted to level set. And if I'm looking down and stuff, just I have a lot of notes and a lot of things that I'm referencing, so please understand that. First, I wanted to level set. One, and the most important thing that we've been saying since we founded the organization in 2011, 2010, was that counting LGBTQ individuals is important. And I'm going to clarify that after I go through some of this a little bit here, but counting is important because for so long, LGBTQ individuals haven't been counted, which essentially ensures that we just don't exist. It doesn't give us a voice. It doesn't give us an opportunity to be heard. As one of the first organizations that was appointed to the Federal Communications Diversity Committee, the first LGBT organizations appointed to that committee, as some of the first individuals to talk about some of the areas when we first founded the organization, one of the very first questions we were getting was, what's gay about technology? And we had to go and answer that in a research format, although me as a gay man and my team know that it has to do with the way that we identify. It has to do with the way that we form our identities, the way we find community, the way we find information, healthcare, especially several years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when community formation was really limited. And so I think it's important to also level set kind of what makes up the LGBTQ community, because we hear a lot of numbers thrown around. So I figured I'd start there with this level setting piece. About 7.1 or 7.2, depending on where you find the statistic, of the population of the United States identify as LGBTQ. That's up from 5.6 in 2020. That means that 18.9 million adults identify as LGBTQ. A lot of people don't realize that that is actually larger than the entire population of veterans that we have here in the United States. 11 million identify as bisexual. That is larger than the entire population of Georgia. 2.6 million identify as lesbians. That's more than every farmer in the United States. 3.7 million identify as gay, and that's larger than the population of Utah. 1.6 million identify as trans, and that is 2 times the number of police that are in the United States. Each year, about 4.2 million youth and young adults experience homelessness in this country, and about 40% of them identify as LGBTQ for a whole host and variety of reasons. That means about 1.6 million LGBTQ individual young adults and youth experience homelessness, and 1.6 million is about the population of Philadelphia. So getting to this point, one of the things that I think it's important to bring up also in this level setting conversation, if you've read the SOGI paper that FPF and LGBT Tech release, some of this is going to sound familiar in the fact that LGBTQ individuals historically, especially if they know the knowledge, older LGBTQ individuals, remember the history and understand the history of how data collection and how data was used against our community. Things from anti-sodomy laws to police raids and entrapment, the lavender scare within the government, as well as the HIV and AIDS epidemic, just to name a few. There was so much data and information used against our community in so many ways to root us out, to try to expose us, to try to in some way ensnare or use laws against us. And so historically, there's been a lot of mistrust in government entities, but also in more public forums and businesses. And obviously some of those pieces, the internet wasn't even around yet, and we weren't collecting big data. Maybe the government was collecting big data through census, but they weren't collecting data like we are today. But I think it's important to recognize that some of those fears are still surfacing for us and resurfacing for some of us in a different way. For our younger population, it's important to recognize that in 2022, 315 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced into law. or were introduced into state houses, recognizing that about 91% of them failed. Still, about 10% of them, 9 to 10%, passed, which is unfortunate. And I think most of us probably know about those or have heard about them in some capacity. I think it's important to recognize that in 2023, there have been 530 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in this country. So way up from last year, and we're only halfway through the year. So kind of level setting there, I thought it was important to make sure that information was out there because it gives a better picture of who we're talking about, how big the community is, and gives some size reference. At least for me, I'm a very visual person. The data itself, as I said in the opening statement, is collecting this data is important because it's important to count LGBTQ individuals. It gives us a voice, it gives us an opportunity to be heard, it gives us an opportunity to be understood. But I think it's really important to make sure that we talk about and understand that if we're collecting that LGBTQ data, that we're also treating it as sensitive data. Sensitive data, sensitive like healthcare information, health information, though that identifiable information that we wouldn't want to be shared. If in a leak, we wouldn't want that information out there, recognizing that there are so many states across the country that are working against the LGBTQ community. And the last thing from a company or an organization perspective, the last thing you want is your name flashed across the news headlines because it had a huge exposure of a very sensitive population. I think as we talk about this and continuing to boil down about data and ethics, and as I think about this, as I've been having conversations with Shay and other individuals at FPF, we've been looking at the way that the White House has been rolling out information, the way that the federal government is working with information, the way that information is being shared with potential states, the way companies are protecting that information. And so as I was thinking about and preparing for this call, I was thinking about what does it mean for an LGBTQ person to share that data? Why would I share a data with a company? Why would I share information with an organization? Why would I feel comfortable sharing that information? And it really comes down to a level of trust. Obviously, a company in itself is not going to have, that direct of a conversation. Maybe they're buying something, but oftentimes we're collecting a lot of information about the person, depending on how they're using the product. If it's more of an interactive platform, just ensuring that we're thinking about, we need to build a level of trust with that community, with that individual. And so by setting that level of trust, we need to make sure that we're thinking about how are we communicating about what we're doing with that information? How are we communicating why we're asking for the information? How are we ensuring that we're communicating to them what we're doing with the information and adhering to that to create that trust? Sometimes that's communicated in the form that they're filling out. Sometimes that's communicated in the process that they're going through. But not always. And sometimes it has to do with the actions or the aftermath of what the company is doing with it. Before I go to there, I think there's a couple points that I wanted to pull up, and which is why I'm on here twice. Last year, we released our SOGI data paper with FPF. That was actually picked up. A lot of people realize a lot of that was picked up and actually shared with the White House in advance of their SOGI best practices data that was released in January of this year. And I've gone through this several times and really looked through it. I'm sharing it now. I've looked through it several times, and I think it's not perfect, and it most certainly doesn't set a standard that would be good for every single business. But I do think it does have some really good points in it. I think that the federal surveys framework actually sets forward a very good framework as far as the way businesses should be thinking about data, the way businesses should be thinking about SOGI data in particular. I also think the Federal Committee on Statistical Methods does a pretty good job about laying some of this out. Some of it applicable to a business or an organization, some of it applicable to only the federal government. I'm going to share that one as well now to make sure I have it. Here we are. And so this goes to my point. There were a lot of pieces in here about explaining why you're asking for the information and ensuring that you're thinking about why you're collecting that information. And so when we're thinking about collecting that information, I wanted to make sure that we were really thinking through not only just the static form collection, but also what types of different collection that we were thinking about. And so as I was looking at the collection process, a couple of the things that came up is that as we're collecting that data, there's areas that do create an inclusive atmosphere for an LGBTQ individual to feel comfortable responding. As I mentioned earlier, you're building a level of trust. So is that explaining what you're doing with the information? Not necessarily always possible to do so. If you're a larger company, you're collecting that information, you're holding on to it, you are securing it in as sensitive information. You have a process internally that is rigorous and make sure that if you are using that information internally, that there is a reason that you're using it internally. A lot of the things that you've heard before or are aware of in these spaces. But I also think there's a level of trust when you're asking for this information, maybe around their sexual orientation. Maybe they're figuring it out. Maybe they're not quite sure if they identify as gay or bisexual. And so giving them the opportunity to select all actually does build a level of trust within our community. I realize for researchers that may send them into a tizzy because all of a sudden you're going from one selection to two selections or more. Maybe someone's just really not sure how they identify yet. They're still kind of figuring it out for themselves. They're really trying to explore that piece of themselves, and they're probably doing it online before they're talking to anyone else about it. But by providing that space for them to select all, you're actually providing a level of trust that you recognize that a person may not necessarily understand where they're at yet, but you are giving them the option to choose multiple selections. That is forming a level of trust. I think it's also important to recognize that in spaces that are maybe more visual. LGBT tech, for example, works heavily in the metaverse. Not only are we working in the metaverse, we're actually building in the metaverse. And we talked a lot about the information and data that can be collected on images. If it's not even moving video, let's just say it's pictures, but there's an option to change, augment. I know there's AI imaging now. But as we're looking at those pieces, someone could very easily select something within a profile builder that says that they're male. But within the actual visual presentation of their avatar could have on a dress or something that is clearly societally norms, not male. That visual information should be looked at and should be treated as sensitive because it does have an opportunity to expose if that information is used in a particular way, if it's identifiable in any particular way. I think it's important to recognize that that can really, that information could be used in a harmful way if that information gets out, especially if you're in a smaller area. I think it's important also to recognize where we work across many different sections as far as data. So we're also looking, some of the other areas that I'm working on with FPF is around youth monitoring. And I've had a lot of conversations with teachers and administrators. And sure, this kind of veers a little bit outside, but I will say there is I want to bring this up because there's an over heightened sense of fear around what information is being collected and how and what access do they have to it, especially in those monitored spaces. And so I wanted to bring that up just because I think it's also important to recognize what subset or who you're targeting and what information that you're asking from them. This goes to the notion of which we all have been talking about in some various way, of the fact that why are we collecting the information? Why is it important? Is it germane to us? I know I opened this conversation by saying that it's important that LGBTQ individuals are counted, but I think it's also important to recognize that they should be counted as long as they can remain safe. And so if you're collecting that information in an environment where maybe that information could be used against the LGBTQ community or against those trying to help those in the LGBTQ community, especially within youth or younger adult populations, it may be a case where it's not wise to collect that type of information because of the ever-changing and ever-evolving circumstances within the states, because we don't have a federal privacy or federal data protection laws that are really concrete in this area. And so I think it's also important to recognize from a business and organization perspective that this information could somehow be tracked outside of your control. It could be collected outside of your control, and recognizing that that could be exposure as well. I wanted to also close in, there's a really good example actually that my colleague Carlos brought up, where a little while ago, where an individual, and this is more of a visual perspective, where you're using publicly available data. And there is a lot of publicly available data out there that's good. Sometimes that publicly available data can satisfy the needs of the business. Maybe it's not a direct marketing tool, but maybe it's more of what is the population of the LGBTQ community in a particular state or a particular region or area. And so I'm actually going to just shift to that for a moment, in that if there is publicly available data and it satisfies your needs of your business or your organization effort, I would really encourage you to turn there first and foremost, because the data has already been collected, de-anonymized. They're with trusted institutions like the Williams Institute, the Movement Advancement Project, and some other organizations that are really focused around research and equity and equality, and also counting LGBTQ individuals, but doing it in a way that's sensitive to potential state laws or things that could potentially harm the community. If you are going to collect that information, thinking about, and if it is publicly available, where maybe you're using that data off of websites, using the data off of the internet. There was an example where a guy actually took a bunch of photos and videos and had scraped them all and were using them to identify, using kind of facial recognition pieces. But he was using that and aggregating it in a way and leaving it open for public consumption, which then exposed a large swath of, or potentially exposed a large swath of the LGBTQ community in a very harmful way. LGBT Tech specifically has worked around this area, worked on facial recognition with NTIA. We've worked with some of the largest databases in the world to ensure that they're writing their procedures in a way that treats any identifiable SOGI information as sensitive. Maybe not requiring it, is not required by law now, but actually flagging it for a company, maybe using that database as, hey, this is potentially SOGI information, and you may want to consider segregating it into a sensitive area so that it doesn't have easy access. And so there's been several instances of this marketing data there at one point, although I don't have the exact terminology in my head right now, but quite a while ago, Netflix was caught in an area where they were using marketing data and inadvertently, exposed that someone was lesbian within an area. So it's just being mindful and being on top of these things, reading through instances that have happened. And I think most importantly, relying on places like FPF and LGBT Tech and others to really think about and come to and ask for additional support and advice around these areas. I will say this is an area that we have engaged with, and with many companies, sometimes working on projects and programs around either data, new software, new products, thinking through the implications of what tracking or collecting certain information would have on all the way from our youngest, maybe not out LGBTQ individual in a household that may or may not be supportive, all the way to our oldest elder LGBTQ individuals who are in a nursing home and may have all the support that they need or may not. And so for each one of those ranges of the LGBTQ population, I think it's important to realize that there's complexities there. It's not just identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, two-spirited, but it's also about the LGBTQ community is not a monolith. And so we may identify as Black and trans, but not out in a community that's not supportive. And that is a much different picture than a gay white man in Stanton, Virginia, that's 37 years old. So it's important to recognize that there's different complexities within here, and that inadvertently a company or an organization could do a lot of damage to a person by collecting that information and using it or not protecting it in a way that is truly treating it like sensitive information. And so I'll close with just saying, reiterating, and I think I love to refer back to this, data is important for our community. And so I've urged people so often to say that if we're not counted, then we don't exist. If we don't have a voice at the table, then we don't have a voice at all. And so I am pushing companies from, and I have from the very beginning. I remember standing in a queue line at the White House with Christopher Wolf, and we were talking about the way the CEDC, or the, CDC spent way too much on an FPF panel committee. The CDC was using information that it was gleaming from Twitter about different potential infectious diseases that were spreading within different states of the country. And it was the early adoption of LGBTQ individuals. LGBTQ individuals actually adopt newer technologies at about twice their heterosexual counterparts. So they're active users on there. But it was because of that information that the CEDC was able to stop the spread of an infectious disease. So from that perspective, we also we recognize the harms that can happen, but we also recognize the benefits that can be gleaned for a community like ours, for a community that just hasn't had a lot of data collected. So I know each circumstance is different. I really tried to go high level here, and I'm going to try to collect a little bit more stats and a little bit more information for you all, and I'll be sure to share that with Shay. I will also say that we're not done. The SOGI paper that we put out was just the first step, and that we are committed to working with FPF and other partners on continuing to ensure that there are standards set around this, that there's communication to federal agencies, the federal government, to businesses, to ensure that they are armed with the best and possible knowledge, best and possible standards to do best by what is a very large community and makes up a huge portion of the population, both here in the United States and globally. And so if you're unsure, I encourage you to reach out to us. I encourage you to reach out to LGBT Tech. I encourage you to reach out to FBF and other organizations, because we are here to help. Most importantly, we're bipartisan. We're here to protect and inform around the LGBTQ community and bring the best possible knowledge to bear. I will also say, I do think it's important to underscore that we're not just a think tank. LGBT Tech is structured in a way that we are grounded in research, our partners, or that which is publicly available or already put out with other organizations. And we use that to inform public policymakers and companies, but we also use it to develop programs like our Power On program and our Paths program, collectively of which this year alone, we'll distribute over $200,000 worth of cash grants to drive LGBTQ into STEAM fields, but also to distribute computers and technology that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. Why is that important? Because every single thing that we do, we have research and metrics built into it. And so that I can easily sit here and say that we're reaching well over 140 to 145,000 LGBTQ individuals across the country through our over 107 centers that we're distributing to, and that includes in 2 US territories, in DC and Puerto Rico, and as far as Alaska. We've also done a little bit of work internationally, working on sharing information with Latin America, the United States and English-speaking areas around encryption and data protection, and also distributing technology in 13 countries in Africa. And so when I say we know what we're talking about, we do, because we have a whole network and community that we're constantly tied to, and that we're hearing from a grassroots community. So when I say that we can help you in ensuring that you're collecting information in an appropriate way, we have real-time on the ground information that we can collect, and an entire network that we're constantly tied to. So I try to go really high level. There's most certainly some deeper areas that we can dive into, but most importantly, thank you so much for listening today, and thank you so much for the opportunity, Shay.